Hey everyone, welcome back to Motion UX. So what is the best app for UX motion design? Well, that's kind of a trick question really, because there are so many tools in this space, but not a single tool really does it all. So we have Figma that's amazing at static UX and UI design, and we can do a little bit of prototyping in there. Then we have tools like After Effects that has no interactivity, but we can animate whatever we wanted to. And then there's some tools like Principle that allow us to do a little bit of interactivity, and tools like Protopie that allow us to really take all of our designs and make really high fidelity prototypes that we're able to test with customers, with users, and really prove out our concepts. So it's not one tool to rule them all, but yet a combination of these tools working together to make the best products and best concepts possible. And so let's dive in to see when these tools are most useful in the design process. Let's get started. So before we jump into all of the programs, I want to take a look at this. This is the classic double diamond that's typically used in some design processes. And the double diamond represents this idea of flaring our ideas and then focusing our ideas. And so we do that in research as we're trying to figure out what is the specific problem space we're trying to dive into, and then also into our actual design. So, hey, here we have some small sketches. We're going to see like how many ideas can we get? Now we're focusing this idea into our like ideal concept or our ideal solution. This is not necessarily a linear process. It's very cyclical. And so you may flare a little bit, you may focus, you may realize, hey, that's not the right solution. So let's go back and flare a little bit. Let's go back and research a little bit. And so it's good to lay down that context as we're looking at when do these specific tools for motion design come into play during the design process. It's also helpful to understand this idea of going from the ideation stage to lo-fi design to hi-fi design, and then ultimately to delivery and production. This right here is just kind of a simple representation of that with this tic-tac-toe app. And so we're going from sketching very, very lo-fi, like just generating ideas very quickly. Then we go into more of a solid lo-fi design. We're starting to see like, okay, what's the hierarchy of this design or these specific screens? Maybe we'll even do like a simple prototype at this stage where we'll see, okay, does the flow make sense? Does the way that things are organized and how you get to different places make sense for the user? And then we start getting into, okay, we're diving into a little bit more of like, let's look at the stylistic approach to things. And we transform this lo-fi design into a hi-fi design. And that's where we ultimately get to what matches really closely to what we have in production, or what ultimately is going to be launched into the world as an app or a website, or an experience that a user at the end of the day interacts with. So now let's take a look at which tools are helpful at which parts of the design process when we're thinking about UX motion design. Right here, I have the entire design process from a visual standpoint kind of laid out here. So we have ideation, lo-fi design, hi-fi design, testing, and then ultimately delivery, where we're sharing those designs with the developer to actually get pushed into a production environment. This is the typical process that you would follow when you're designing something. Again, it's not always linear. You may get to hi-fi and realize like, hey, this solution doesn't work. Let's go back to the ideation stage and start churning some more ideas out. And so when we're looking at ideation, this is the part of the process where, hey, we've identified there is a problem space. Maybe we have some hypotheses of what might solve that problem, and we're just throwing down ideas. And really, the best place for this to start is as lo-fi as possible. And so I recommend just like getting out a sketchbook, drawing a bunch of stuff, just writing words. You can just get a Word document out, write down some ideas as they're coming to you as quickly as you can. And so the idea for this is that the tool doesn't really get in the way of your ideas. Throughout this entire process, your tool should never be getting in the way of your ideas. But the ideation portion is when we're just trying to get all of our concepts, all of our ideas, all of our thoughts out on paper, on something physical, so that we can later go back and review it. What is also super helpful is having a physical whiteboard, so you can have a little bit of a bigger space, especially when you're working with other designers or other people that are part of the project, where you have one person in charge of writing things down. Everyone's just kind of yelling out ideas. You can use Post-it notes, so everyone kind of has their own focus time. Everyone's writing down their ideas. Then you put them up on the whiteboard and kind of share. And so during this stage, I would say the least technical that you can do and the most accessible, the better. If you're doing things remotely, Figma has a new tool called FigJam that's integrated into Figma that really helps facilitate this stage of the design process. It's super easy to use and kind of emulates that whiteboarding design session in a remote environment. After the ideation phase, you start narrowing ideas down. You say, okay, like these 4 ideas seem like they're like pretty good. Let's kind of explore these a little bit further. And that's when we're kind of jumping into more of a lo-fi stage, where we're taking these rough ideas and we're focusing them in, we're exploring them a little bit more. Again, I would suggest like a notebook, paper and pencil, like still staying at that whiteboard. You're just saying, okay, this is our overarching idea. Let's just hash it out a little bit further in a very lo-fi, sketchy way. And as you kind of get a little bit more concrete with those ideas, you may want to then jump into something like Figma, and you're using very basic boxes. And so you may have a design that looks like this. And it's like, who really knows what this means? But you as a designer are just trying to work out ideas of like, how are things going to be placed here? You have like simple text. Maybe you just have like just a list of words, and that kind of helps you understand what is that user flow and all of those sorts of things. But again, we're talking about specifically, where does UX motion design fit into this whole design process, right? And the first tool specifically for UX motion design that I have here is an iPad app called Rough Animator. And this app you can think of as a kind of a flip book, frame by frame animation app for your iPad. And essentially it allows you to have that same kind of sketchy lo-fi mentality of doing it on a sketchbook and on a whiteboard, but you're just kind of drawing out frame by frame. And so if you have like a specific transition or interaction that you're going for, you can easily sketch that out frame by frame on this Rough Animator. It doesn't need to look pretty, but it's just to get that idea out and say like, okay, how are things going to actually start moving on paper? And also within this, we can start actually thinking about how do we sketch motion in a static form. And so getting out my notebook here, you can see that you can really just easily just frame by frame, the similar thing as how you would do it with that iPad app. You're just doing it here, just frame by frame on more of a static form of saying like, okay, you would first see this, then this is like a transition type of frame, and then this is ultimately what it would land on. And so you can start trying to imagine and concept out like, what would those transitions, what would those interactions look like, just using a notebook. And then this last tool here is Principle. And Principle is a really basic prototyping tool that you can do a little bit of designing inside of this, but it's best used in conjunction with Figma. And so I'll design things in Figma, import it over to Principle, and that's where I'll do a little bit of prototyping. So to give you an idea of what that would look like, I actually have these screens right here, and we can say this is the start screen, this is the end screen, and let's go into Principle and import these. And so we have this one, and we can select these specific frames. We can go over here and we can import selected frames. And so now in Principle, we have these two basically like artboards or frames here, and we can set up some sort of like interactions and things. And here you can see that there's a little preview window. And once I have these interactions set up, this is where you'll see the magic start happening. So what I want to do is when I click on this green thing, I want it to go to this other screen here as kind of like continuing. And so I can tap on this little lightning bolt. I can say when I tap, I'll go over here. And so now if I tap, it'll go over here. And it does its own little smart animating. But if we actually take a look at this specific interaction, we have all of this control of how we want it to animate in a specific way. We're still in kind of the lo-fi stage, right? So not all of this really matters as much, but maybe you want to see like, how does choreographing specific elements look? We're still not using like final elements here, but we want to see like, how would something transition from one screen to the next? And so this is a really good tool that gives you a little bit more control than a Figma Smart Animate would. And so you have that opportunity to explore some of that UX motion without getting bogged down by a heavy tool like After Effects. And of course, we have prototyping right here inside of Figma that we can have a little bit of animation with as well. And so if we set up the similar type of interaction where we tap this and it moves to here, we can set this to be a smart animate. And really the most control that we have here is the timing and the easing of things when they happen. And if we go ahead and we start that, we can now see what that looks like. And you can see that what we got here is very similar to what we would have in Principle, but Principle allows us to do other things like a hover animation. So if we say, if we want to hover inside and we want it to basically expand, and when we hover outside, we're gonna go back there. And so now we have this very simple interaction that only takes a few clicks to set up, where we have this hover interaction, where we could get something similar inside of Figma, but again, it just might take a little bit longer to achieve something like this inside of Figma. And so if you have slightly more complicated things that Figma doesn't really have tools for, Principal is a good next step before going on to something more robust like After Effects. So I'm sure you noticed that After Effects is not listed inside of this lo-fi category. And that's because After Effects is kind of a beast of a tool, right? It allows you to do really anything you want, minus any type of interactivity, but it allows you to create any type of interactions and animations and transitions that you would ever need. But since it's so robust of a tool, doing something super simple, like this type of hover effect that we have here, would take you a lot longer in a tool like After Effects. And then also needing to share that as a GIF to somebody and then make edits later on. Like doing all of those sorts of things takes a lot longer in After Effects. And at this lo-fi stage, the specific easing curves and timing and all of those sorts of things, like down to the milliseconds, don't matter as much. And so we don't need that granularity of control that After Effects gives us. And so our goal here is let's just continue to get ideas out. Let's continue to refine our ideas down into the best ideas possible. And these tools that I listed here really help you get to that a lot quicker. After the lo-fi stage, we move on to the hi-fi stage. And just to give you a visual representation, it would be as our design kind of gets to that final look and we're really narrowing down on like the style, the hierarchy, the layout, all of those sorts of things. We're starting to really like refine that one key idea and that key concept. And so that's when we kind of look at some other tools to help make our ideas a little bit more robust. You see, we still have Figma in here because Figma, yes, it allows us to do all of that design static to make that as hi-fi as possible. And then we can get a little bit of prototyping in there as well, but not as robust as some other tools. And so that's why in here I have ProtoPie. And ProtoPie is an amazing tool. If you check out my other video, you can kind of see a little bit more of an in-depth overview of what ProtoPie can do. But in very basic terms, Figma's prototyping method, and similarly with Principal, is screen-based prototyping. And so that means every time you want to have a specific interaction, you need to have a screen for that specific interaction. If we take a look at ProtoPie here, we have this prototype that I previously created. Already this looks very robust. Like we have some animations here. They're actually running Lottie animations. Just being able to have a Lottie animation within your prototype makes the fidelity and the realism of it so much more than what you can achieve inside of Figma. The way that ProtoPie is different is that it's trigger based. And so if you saw right when I restart this, you can see we have a little bit of a fade in animation. We have these two things animating on their own, offset the timing so that one happens and then the next, and then one happens and the next. All of this is happening on one screen. We also have these little click interactions. And then we have this transition that then is taking us from one screen to the next. But then on this screen, we have all of these different types of interactions where we can click these colors. We can have a video embedded here so that it looks like someone's actually drawing. We have this call to action that kind of like zooms in and rotates a little bit. So all of that is happening on a single screen. And we set that up with a multitude of interactions. And so you can see it can get very layered and very complex, but as you start to understand trigger-based prototyping versus screen-based prototyping, it actually allows you to make more robust prototypes that are easier to maintain and update as you're designing something. As we're moving into our high fidelity part of our design process, ProtoPie really allows us to create really realistic, high fidelity feeling prototypes. The next tool in this list is After Effects. So finally, we're at After Effects, the tool that you probably have heard the most about when it comes to motion design and animation. But specifically in the UX motion design realm, After Effects excels most when we start getting to the high fidelity animations. And so maybe our designs are done and we really want to create the most robust looking animation. And maybe we're just more familiar with After Effects than we are a tool like ProtoPie. And we don't necessarily need this to be interactive. So therefore, After Effects really fits the use case for this process. And so I'm just pulling up this old After Effects project that I have, and you can see in here, we get to lay down specific keyframes, we get to have specific easings, and we really have 100% control over every aspect of our animation. And you can see here we can add these little tap markers so that it feels a little bit more interactive. And so like if we're creating a concept demo, it's a little bit more clear where the interactions are happening and why they're happening and so on and so forth. And it's here in After Effects where we have access to just an array of plugins that help this animation process be a little bit easier. And we also have access to this tool called Inspector Spacetime. And this tool allows us to select any number of keyframes that we have and get the specs from those keyframes. So if I have these keyframes selected and I get the specs, you can see that it tells me what layer it is, what property is changing, what the duration is, what the easing is, what the delay is, all of those sorts of things. And all of this information is really helpful for a developer as you're working on that handoff stage of, hey, how is this actually moving? And what percentage is it moving? And this gives your developer that inside look, okay, what is happening underneath this animation that I know what values to pull to actually put into the CSS or Swift or whatever platform they're working on. And then the last hi-fi tool here is Principal. And so as we looked at before, Principal is really, really quick in creating kind of one-off interactions. And so if I have just two screens that I'm trying to create an animation or an interaction on, then that's really, really helpful just to create that one-off thing. But when we're thinking about the entire experience or the entire application as a whole, or the problem that you're trying to solve, it doesn't really allow you to create that full journey as easily. So ProtoPie is really that one tool that allows us to create an entire experience, that entire journey within a singular tool. And that's really, really helpful to have. So now moving over to testing. So testing really can happen and should happen in the early stages. It should happen in the middle of the process. It should happen at the end of the process. And when I say testing, I'm talking more like user testing, not necessarily, hey, we launched a beta version of this and we want to see how it works, because that would involve already working with developers, getting things into production, and all of those sorts of things. But this is more in the realm of user testing. This is when you have a concept in Figma, it's ready to be linked up to a prototype, and we just want to validate that our idea makes sense, that things flow well together. And so Figma is here, of course, and it's a very just simple, easy tool to prototype things. It's easy to just share a link out to a user testing participant. It's easy to link up all of our screens together, as we saw right down here. But when we're trying to test out specific interactions that may be more complex, maybe a little bit unique, that's where Figma starts to fall apart, because we're limited in the amount of interactions that we can do in Figma. And so that's where ProtoPie really excels. And so if we take a look back at ProtoPie, we can just go ahead and preview this here. And so maybe on this, we want to be able to test, hey, we have this like app loading type of animation. We want to see how users like that, but we also want them to be able to interact with our application. All of that you just saw was a video rendered out of After Effects and put into this prototype. And you can't get that inside of Figma, and you can't have a video playing in Figma. The closest you can get to that is a GIF, but then you get to really high load times, you get to heavy file sizes, and then the quality of a GIF just isn't that good compared to a video. And now we're also into this screen where we have this call to action that kind of like zooms in and moves around a little bit to draw the user's attention to the next step. That's also something that's not really possible inside of Figma. And so to be able to create a prototype that is at its highest fidelity, to get the best testing results back, ProtoPie really excels at that and allows us to create a prototype that feels very, very close to the real thing. And finally, we're on to delivery. Each step in this design process is super important to getting your ideas refined and communicating them clearly. And delivery is absolutely very important. And so this is the point where, hey, we have our final idea. We think the solution is going to be successful. We have our designs, they're high fidelity. We kind of have design specs made up. We also need to have specs for the specific interactions, the animations, the transitions, to be able to communicate to the developers and engineers that are going to be building this thing. How does the thing actually move, and what does the interaction actually look like? And so Figma is really helpful in having those design specs, kind of adding some text and context to, hey, this is the interaction, maybe this is the delay, this is the Bezier values, and so that developers can kind of like come in and copy and paste. But what's really helpful is pairing that with After Effects. And so inside of After Effects, I typically create some sort of motion spec that can look like something like this. And so it has the animation happening, but then also all of the durations here happening at the same time. Within that, we kind of have a shorthand here of like, hey, this is the enter easing, this is the exit easing, this is the standard easing, so that the developers understand what to map things to. And then through all of these durations, you can see how long a specific element needs to be moving. So that is the design process. And let's just go ahead and zoom out so we can just see what the full design process may look like for a UX motion designer and all of their tools. And so we have FigJam, we have Figma, Rough Animator, Principal, ProtoPie, After Effects, all of these tools working together, utilizing all of their strengths to make the best ideas possible. And that is it, everyone. These are the best applications, the best tools for any UX motion designer. Each tool has their own strengths, their own weaknesses, and when we really use them together at the appropriate time in the design process, we can utilize every single strength and create the best ideas possible. Catch you all next time.